I've practiced medicine for 41 years, delivered babies, amputated limbs, walked 3 miles through January snow to reach a sick child. People call me a good doctor. I don't correct them. But there is one thing I've never spoken aloud. One thing that sits in my chest like a stone and grows heavier with time, not lighter. It is what we did to women, not out of cruelty. That's what makes it so hard to face. Out of certainty. Out of the deep, unquestioned belief that we knew their bodies better than they did. That their pain was ours to measure. Their suffering, ours to classify. Their lives, ours to manage. We called ourselves healers, men of science, and we were. But science can justify almost anything if you shape the questions carefully enough. I'm 80 years old. My hands shake when I pour my coffee. The dead have waited long enough for someone to tell the truth about them. So I will. I was born in November of 1843 in Ohio, a cold, flat state. My father was a school teacher, not a wealthy man, but an educated one, which in the Ohio of those years was a kind of wealth in itself. He believed in books the way religious men believe in Scripture, with a faith that was total and unsentimental and entirely sincere. Our house had more books than furniture, floor-to-ceiling shelves in the parlor, stacks on the stairs, volumes in the kitchen that Mother moved out of her way without complaint. The smell of old paper and ink was the smell of my childhood, as specific and permanent as the smell of wood smoke or river water. Father taught at the county school, taught every grade in the same room, taught children who came in barefoot through October, and older boys who'd already been working farms since they were 8 and didn't see much use in sitting at a desk. He had patience for all of them. He believed that learning could change a life. He was right about that. It changed mine. I'm not sure it changed theirs. Mother was quieter than Father, smaller too, though she was stronger than she looked. She had dark eyes that saw everything and a mouth that said very little of what they saw. She ran the house, raised 4 children, kept the garden, preserved the food for winter, sewed our clothes, mended them when they tore, nursed us when we were sick, kept the accounts, managed the money Father was too distracted to manage himself, and did all of this without complaint or ceremony, without expectation of thanks, without ever sitting down in the middle of the afternoon and saying she was tired. Because she didn't sit down in the middle of the afternoon. She was simply always working. I never saw her read for pleasure the way Father did. There was no time for that. Women's work was unrelenting in a way that men's work was not. A school teacher finished when the school day finished. A mother never finished. I understood this dimly as a boy, the way you understand things you see every day without ever examining. I didn't understand what it meant, what it cost her, until much later, until I was old enough to add it up. I decided to become a doctor when I was 12 years old. A man named Dr. Elias Caldwell came to our town, set up practice in a 2-room office above the dry goods store. He was perhaps 50, gray at the temples, with hands that were large and very still. He let me follow him sometimes after school, on calls he judged appropriate for a boy to witness. I'd carry his bag, hold the lamp, watch while he worked. He had steady hands and a calm voice, and people trusted him the way they trust a man who has looked at death enough times to stop flinching at it. The dying trusted him. I saw that. Saw the way a man with a chest wound would grab Dr. Caldwell's sleeve and hold on, not asking him to fix anything, just wanting him present. That seemed to me the most important thing a person could be, the one you held on to. I wanted to be that. It seemed like a noble purpose. I still believe it is. I just didn't understand yet what other purposes got tangled up in it. I went to medical school in Philadelphia, Jefferson Medical College, the fall of 1862. The war was on. Half the men in my class would go directly into military service after graduation. Most of what we studied was surgery because surgery was what the war required. How to cut cleanly and quickly. How to amputate below the knee, above the knee, at the hip, How to clamp a bleeder with 2 fingers while another man worked. How to debride a wound so infection had less to feed on. How to tell a wound that would heal from a wound that wouldn't, and say so plainly to a man who was already frightened. We were trained to be decisive, to act on partial information without hesitation, because in surgery hesitation was its own kind of harm. I believe that training shaped everything I did afterward: the decisiveness, the authority, the certainty that I knew what needed doing and the patient's role was to cooperate. The curriculum on women's medicine was thin. I want to be precise about this because it matters. We had perhaps 6 lectures on childbirth and obstetric complications, 1 chapter in the primary textbook on hysteria, a few pages on chlorosis, which was what they called anemia in young women, though they didn't know yet that's what it was. Some notes on the management of the female nervous temperament, which was a phrase used to describe any emotional response in a woman that made her physician uncomfortable. The assumption underneath all of it, never stated as a principle but present in every sentence, was that women's bodies were variants of men's bodies, smaller, weaker, less rational, more susceptible to the influence of the nerves and the emotions. The womb was thought to have direct influence on the mind, which was why women were prone to irrationality in ways men were not. That was the framework. That was what 6 years of medical education handed to me. I took it and put it in my bag alongside my stethoscope and my surgical kit and went to work. I began my practice in 1866 back in Ohio, in a town called Millfield. Small town, perhaps 800 souls, farming country mostly, with a sawmill and a dry goods store and 2 churches that didn't speak to each other. Patients who paid when they could, sometimes in money, more often in potatoes or a dressed chicken or a side of pork when they couldn't. I didn't mind the pork. I was young, 23 years old, renting a room above the livery stable, eating most of my meals at the boarding house down the road. I was grateful for anything that supplemented the cash I didn't always have. I was young and eager and certain I knew enough to help. That certainty was the thing medical school gave me most thoroughly, and it was the thing that did the most damage in the years that followed. The first years of practice were a kind of education that no textbook provides. You learn quickly that patients don't present the way cases in textbooks present. You learn that people don't always tell the truth, not because they're dishonest, but because they don't know how to say what's actually wrong, or they're afraid of what you'll say back, or they've been living with something so long they've stopped thinking of it as something that can be named or treated. You learn that poverty causes illness in ways that medicine cannot fix. You learn that children die of things that have no cure and no explanation, and that the grief of a parent watching that happen is something you carry in your body afterward, in your chest, and it doesn't go away. You learn to carry it without showing it because your patients need you steady. I learned all those things quickly. They were the lessons that made me a better doctor. What I was slower to learn was what I was failing to see. The women who came to my office, or more often to whose houses I was called, because women with young children couldn't leave their houses to come to me. The wives of farmers, of merchants, of the mill workers who'd come to town when the sawmill opened. They came with complaints I was trained to classify and therefore to dismiss. Nervous exhaustion, hysteria, weakness of constitution, melancholia, neurasthenia. We had many names for the condition of women who were not functioning the way their husbands and families required them to function. I treated them as I was taught. Recommended rest, which was impossible for a woman with 4 children, and no household help. Prescribed tonics that contained iron and alcohol, and occasionally opium, and did little beyond making the women sleepy enough to stop expressing what they were feeling. Told them to avoid excitement, as if excitement were something they had access to. Told them to trust in their husband's judgment. That one I am most ashamed of now. Told them to trust in their husband's judgment, as though the husband's judgment were not, in many cases, the source of the condition I was supposedly treating. I documented everything carefully, used the correct terminology, consulted my textbooks when a case confused me, referred the more difficult cases to colleagues in Columbus who specialized in women's diseases and who had considerably more confidence than I did in their ability to manage the female nervous temperament. I was a conscientious young doctor. I kept good records. I had a careful diagnostic process. I was, by every measure my profession used to evaluate such things, doing my job correctly. What I was not doing, what it would take me another decade to begin doing, was asking what was actually wrong. Not what the symptoms were, what was wrong. Those are different questions. The first one I was trained to answer. The second one nobody had taught me to ask. The thing nobody told me, the thing I had to discover myself through the accumulation of years and faces and stories I couldn't quite make fit the diagnoses I was writing, was that most of what I was treating as disease was circumstance. Women who were exhausted because they never stopped working and never would until they died. Women who were melancholic because they were trapped in lives they hadn't chosen and had no mechanism to change. Women who were hysterical because they had no other language, no other outlet for the desperation and anger and grief they lived with every day. Women whose bodies were worn to the edge of function from bearing child after child with no rest between, no recovery, no say in whether it happened again. I looked at their symptoms and wrote diagnoses. I should have looked at their lives. I should have asked different questions. But I didn't know to ask them. Nobody had taught me to ask them. That is not an excuse. It is just the truth. And the truth is that it took me far too long to figure it out on my own. The first time I truly saw it, truly saw what I had been looking at without seeing, was the spring of 1871. A woman named Mrs. Eliza Harmon. I was called to her house in the middle of March, mud season, the roads nearly impassable, the kind of Ohio spring that makes you believe winter will never actually end. Her husband had sent his oldest boy to fetch me, a child of perhaps 10, who rode 3 miles bareback on a horse too big for him, and arrived at my door in the dark with his face red from cold and his expression very serious. He said his mother was unwell, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, stayed in bed. I asked how long. He said 3 weeks. I asked what had happened 3 weeks ago. He looked at the floor and said, "The baby came." I expected to find what I usually found when called to a new mother, a woman thin from blood loss, maybe running a low fever, maybe struggling to nurse. Anemia was common. Infection was common. I had my remedies ready in my bag before I arrived at the house. What I found stopped me cold in the doorway of the bedroom. Mrs. Harmon was 31 years old. She had the face of a woman of 50. Not the lined face of someone who has aged badly, but the empty face of someone who has withdrawn from the surface of themselves, retreated somewhere deep and unreachable. She lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling, and when I spoke to her, she turned her head and looked at me, and I could see she was registering my presence but could not summon the energy or will to respond to it. The room was cold. The fire had gone out. The baby was in a cradle beside the bed, crying in the thin, persistent way of a baby that has been crying a long time and no longer expects an answer. 3 other children stood in the doorway, watching with the wide, still eyes of children who have understood that something is wrong and have been afraid to make it worse. Her husband hovered behind me, a large man, not unkind-looking, but frightened in the way men are frightened by things they cannot fix with their hands. He said she'd been like this since the baby came, said she wouldn't get up, wouldn't eat unless he put the food in her hand, said he needed her well, he had spring planting coming and the children needed tending and he couldn't manage without her. He wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't complaining in the way of a man who didn't care about his wife. He was frightened, and his fear expressed itself the way men's fear often does, as practicality, as the enumeration of requirements. He needed her well. That was what he knew how to say. I examined her, Heart sound, lungs clear, no fever, no infection that I could identify. The baby looked healthy. The birth had apparently been uncomplicated. The third delivery, not a difficult labor by the account of the midwife who'd attended. Physically, she was, by my instruments, intact. I had no diagnosis for what I was seeing because I had no category for it. I wrote in my notes that evening, puerperal melancholia, nervous exhaustion following delivery. Recommend tonic and rest. I left a bottle of iron and alcohol mixture with the husband. Told him to make sure she ate. Told him she'd come right in a few weeks. Rode home through the mud, feeling that I had done what I could. It was only later, years later, sitting with the memory of her face, that I began to understand what I'd actually seen in that room. Not a medical condition. A woman who had delivered her fourth child in 5 years, with no help and no rest, who had no family within 50 miles, who lived on a farm miles from any neighbor, who was subject entirely to the requirements of a husband, who was not cruel, but who experienced her as a resource rather than a person, and whose mind had finally done the only thing it had left to do. It had gone somewhere else. Gone somewhere quiet and dark and unreachable where nobody could ask anything of her. And I had given her husband a bottle of tonic and told him she'd come right in a few weeks, as though what ailed her was a deficiency of iron, as though iron was what she needed, and not, at minimum, a single person willing to ask her what her life was like. The childbirth itself. I have to speak about the childbirth, because that was where the harm was most visible and most ignored, and because I participated in it directly and cannot pretend otherwise. 41 years of practice. I attended hundreds of births. I stopped keeping an exact count somewhere around the 200th because counting meant holding each one in detail, and some of them I couldn't carry that way. I attended births in clean farmhouses with good fires and women who had mothers and sisters nearby, and births in cold tenement rooms in the industrial towns that grew up along the railroads, rooms where 5 people slept, and there was no clean water, and the light from a single candle was all there was to work by. I attended births that went smoothly, where the baby came in 8 hours, and both mother and child were well, and I rode home feeling useful. I attended births that lasted 2 days, and ended with a dead child and a mother too weak to grieve. I attended births that ended with both of them gone, and I drove home from those in a particular silence I have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Here is what a birth looked like in those years. A woman would labor for hours, sometimes many hours, 8, 12, 20, sometimes longer. I attended one birth in 1878 that went 36 hours before it was over, and what was over at the end of it was the mother. She was 24 years old. She had labored for 36 hours and then died of exhaustion and hemorrhage, and I stood there in that room with blood on my coat and the baby alive in the cradle, and her husband asking me what had happened, and I had no answer that was adequate to the question. The pain of labor in those years. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I am a man who witnessed it, but never experienced it, and that distinction matters. What I can say is what I observed. I observed women in pain that removed them from ordinary consciousness. I observed women who had been composed and stoic in their daily lives become entirely different people under the force of it. I observed women lose language, lose the ability to communicate in sentences, lose everything except the physical animal experience of their bodies doing something enormous and uncontrollable. I observed women beg, not beg for anything specific that could be given, just beg in the general direction of a god or a midwife or a doctor or the room itself for it to stop, for some relief, for some acknowledgement that what was happening to them was extreme. And what did we do? We stood beside them and told them to bear down. We told them they were doing well when the honest thing to say was that they were surviving something that should not have had to be survived without help. We said the pain was natural. We said it was God's design, the consequence of Eve, written in Genesis. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. Some of my colleagues said this to women mid-labor, said it as theology, as comfort, as instruction, as though a woman in the 32nd hour of labor needed to know that her suffering was scripturally authorized. I did not say it, but I did not say anything different. I just worked. Cut when I had to cut, stitched when I had to stitch, turned babies when they came wrong side, removed pieces of placenta with my hands, did what the work required and called it medicine and went home and wrote it in my notes, and did not lie awake about it because I had been taught not to lie awake about it. You couldn't practice if you lay awake about everything. That's what I told myself. That's what they told us. Move on, next patient. That's the job. In 1847, the year I was 4 years old, a doctor named James Young Simpson demonstrated in Edinburgh that chloroform could eliminate the pain of childbirth entirely. By the time I graduated from medical school in 1866, this was well documented, well published, available to any physician who chose to use it. And the response of the medical establishment, the response of the respected journals and the eminent professors and the men who shaped the standard of care, was largely to argue against it, argue that labor pain was natural and therefore should not be removed, argue that women who delivered without feeling the pain were less bonded to their infants, argue that the pain served a purpose, though the purpose was never clearly identified, argue that the risks of anesthesia outweighed the benefits of removing what they had classified as ordinary suffering. These were not ignorant men. These were educated, published, respected physicians. They made this argument for decades. They made it without consulting the women, without asking a single laboring woman whether she would prefer to feel every moment of it. I used chloroform when I had it, and when the birth was difficult enough that even the conventions of the time acknowledged intervention was warranted. I am not proud of that qualification. Difficult enough, as though ordinary agony didn't qualify. As though there was a threshold of suffering below which a woman was expected to simply endure, and above which I would condescend to help. I attended births where the chloroform was in my bag, and I didn't use it because the birth was progressing normally. Normal meaning, the woman was in severe pain and screaming, and the baby was coming correctly and no one was dying yet. Normal, that was normal. I sat beside women in that condition with chloroform in my bag. I want you to understand what that means. I had something that would have helped, and I chose not to use it because the suffering didn't meet my professional threshold for extraordinary. That is not medicine. That is a man deciding another person's pain doesn't matter enough to relieve. The stitching. I have to speak about the stitching separately because it was the part that, in retrospect, I am least able to justify. A significant portion of births resulted in tearing. The baby's head is large. The passage it comes through is not designed with comfort in mind. Tearing was common, often severe, and if left unstitched, would cause problems that lasted a woman's lifetime. Inability to control the bladder, pain during marital relations that never resolved, structural damage that compounded with each subsequent birth. So stitching was necessary. I understood that then, and I understand it now. What was done before stitching, or rather, what was not done, is the part I return to. There was no anesthetic for the stitching. I want to say that plainly before I explain it, because I don't want the explanation to sound like justification. There was no local anesthetic that could be practically applied in a home birth setting in those years. Chloroform was available, but sedating a woman who had just delivered, who might need to nurse, whose vital signs needed monitoring, carried risks. The practical reality of a home birth in rural Ohio meant that if a woman tore and needed stitching, she was stitched without numbing of any kind, with catgut thread and a curved needle, by lamplight often, with whatever assistant was available to hold the lamp and sometimes to hold the patient. I stitched women while they screamed. I stitched women while they were held down by their mothers or their sisters because they couldn't hold still from the pain. I stitched women who had just survived labors of 12, 15, 20 hours and were then asked to survive this on top of it. I was good at stitching, I was fast, and I was neat, and I was gentle as speed permitted. I was proud of my stitching. I remember that pride with something close to nausea now, looking back. I was proud of being fast, as if the speed made it better, as if 10 minutes of fire was meaningfully different from 20 minutes of fire to the woman experiencing it. I told myself I was helping them. I was, and I was also causing them pain that I was minimizing in my own mind because it was necessary, and I had been trained not to dwell on necessary pain. One night in the winter of 1874, I stitched a woman named Mrs. Clara Briggs while her husband stood outside the bedroom door. She was 26 years old, first child. The labor had been long and the tearing had been significant. She had nothing left. She had used everything she had getting the baby out. When I began the stitching, she made a sound I have never heard from another human being. Not a scream. Something below screaming. Something that came from a place deeper than ordinary suffering. Her mother was holding her shoulders. Her mother was crying. I stitched. I stitched 7 stitches as quickly as my hands could manage, and every stitch was that sound. When I finished, she lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and didn't move for a long time. Her mother wiped her face. The baby was in the cradle across the room. Nobody spoke. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen for an hour in the dark before I went to bed. That's all I allowed myself. An hour. Then I went to bed because I had 2 calls to make the next morning. That was the training talking. Move on. Next patient. That's the job. And I did move on. I made my calls the next morning. I kept practicing. I kept stitching. But Mrs. Clara Briggs has been in the back of my mind for 50 years. That sound that came from somewhere below screaming. I hear it sometimes when it's very quiet. I think I will hear it until I die. There was a treatment for female nervous complaints that was used widely in my time. It was in the textbooks. It was taught in the medical schools. Respectable women were brought to doctors' offices for it by their husbands. I will not use its clinical name because the clinical name was precisely the problem. The clinical name made it medicine, made it respectable, made it something that appeared in journals and was discussed at conferences and was written about by professors with titles and credentials. I will just say what it was. A physician would touch a woman in a specific way to produce a physical response that was believed to relieve the symptoms of hysteria. That was the treatment. That was what went into my case notes as treatment administered, patient improved. I performed this treatment in my early years of practice. I was 23 years old and had been handed a framework by the profession I had spent 6 years training to join, and I used that framework because I believed it, not because I was cruel, not because I was seeking anything for myself, because I was a young doctor in 1866, and this was what the textbook said, and the professors taught, and the established practitioners did, and I had not yet developed either the experience or the moral vocabulary to question it. I write that not as an excuse, but as an honest account of how harm gets perpetuated through institutions. The young men enter the profession and are handed the framework of the men who came before. And the framework has the authority of tradition, and the authority of publication, and the authority of the men who hold the degrees and the titles. And the young men use the framework, because that is what you do with a framework you've been given by people you trust. I performed this treatment on women who came into my examination room and sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at the window or the floor or anywhere except at me. Women who didn't speak unless I asked them a direct question. Women who had nothing in their expressions that I was willing to look at carefully, because looking carefully would have required me to ask what I was seeing, and asking would have required me to question what I was doing, and questioning was not something the framework I'd been given encouraged. There was one woman, I'll call her Mrs. A, because I won't give her real name even now, 50 years later, because she is perhaps still alive somewhere, and because she deserves the small privacy of anonymity. She came to me for 2 years. Her husband brought her every month, waited in the outer room, escorted her home. She sat in my examination room and stared at the wall. I don't know what she thought about during those appointments. I never asked. She never volunteered. I performed the treatment and wrote in my notes afterward that she had responded well. That was what I wrote. Patient responded well. One spring day in 1869, she arrived alone. No husband. She sat in my examination room and she looked directly at me, which was unusual, and she said, "Dr. Harris, I am not ill. I am unhappy. My husband drinks. We have very little money. My eldest child is sickly, and I don't know if she'll live through another winter. I am frightened almost all of the time. Can medicine fix any of those things?" I sat across from her, and I had my medical bag and my training and 2 years of treating her nervous condition, and I had nothing to say, not because I didn't know the answer. The answer was obvious, and she knew it too, which was why she'd asked it. Medicine couldn't fix those things. I couldn't fix those things. What she was describing wasn't disease. What she was describing was her life. And I had been treating her for 2 years with a treatment that addressed none of it, and called it medicine. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood, put on her coat, buttoned it deliberately from the bottom button to the top, picked up her bag, and walked out. She never came back. I never saw her again. I stopped performing that treatment within the month. Not because I had a sudden illumination, because she had named what it was, and I couldn't unknow the name. But stopping is not the same as undoing. You cannot give back 2 years of a woman's life. You cannot unsit with her in that room every month and call it medicine. You can only stop and carry it. By 1880, I had been practicing for 14 years, and I had begun to see things differently, not all at once. The way you begin to see something differently is the same as the way you fail to see it in the first place. Gradually, through accumulation, through a series of small adjustments that don't feel like they add up to much until one day you look at where you are and realize you've traveled a considerable distance from where you started. I understood by then that most of what the medical profession called female nervous temperament was women responding rationally to irrational conditions. I understood that a woman who wept constantly might be living with a man who frightened her. I understood that exhaustion in a woman who had borne 6 children in 8 years was not a medical condition but a human one, and that the appropriate response was not a tonic, but rest, which she was not permitted to have, and acknowledgement, which I could provide at least in the small space of my examination room. I began asking different questions, not diagnostic questions, questions about her life, her household, her husband. I began listening to the answers in a different way, not as symptoms to be classified, but as information about the actual situation. These seem like small and obvious changes now. They did not feel small then. When I began doing this, my colleagues thought I was wasting time, getting too involved, losing clinical objectivity. One of them told me that treating the social situation was the work of the church, not the physician. That was not an unreasonable thing to say in 1880. I just had stopped believing it. In 1882, a young woman came to my office on a Thursday morning in October. She was 22 years old. She was 4 months into her 3rd pregnancy. I could see from the way she walked to the chair that she was in pain, not the expected discomforts of pregnancy, but a deeper pain, the pain of a body that is running out of what it needs to continue. She was gray-faced. Her hands, when I took her pulse, were cold. She had the eyes of a person who has been afraid for a long time and has stopped expecting the fear to end. She told me that her first 2 deliveries had been very difficult. The second one, she had nearly died from hemorrhage. She told me that her youngest child was 14 months old and she had not slept a full night since his birth. She told me that she was 4 months pregnant and she was afraid. Then she looked at me and said, plainly, without evasion, "I cannot do this again. I cannot survive another delivery. I have 2 children who need their mother alive. I am asking you to help me." I knew what she was asking. She meant it plainly, and I understood it plainly, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I felt that she was right. Not morally, not in the framework the law and the church provided, but medically, humanly, in the basic accounting of the situation. This woman's life was in genuine danger. She had the history, the physical condition, and the reasonable fear of a woman who might not survive what was coming. And she was asking me, her physician, the person whose entire professional identity was built around the preservation of life, to help her. I told her there was nothing I could do. Those were my exact words, nothing I could do. What I meant was, the law prohibited what she was asking. The profession would censure any physician who provided it, and I did not have the courage to act against either. What I should have said is the thing I live with now. I should have said, the law and the profession and the moral conventions of the time have created a situation in which your life is of less legal consequence than the continuation of a pregnancy you cannot safely carry. I should have said that to her, so she at least knew her situation clearly. I didn't. I said nothing I could do and sent her home with a different tonic. She survived that birth. I found out from a neighbor 6 months later. I thought of her sometimes after that with something close to relief, which I now recognize as what it was. Relief for myself, for not having to carry her among the others. 3 years later I learned that she had died of childbed fever 10 days after her 4th delivery. She was 25 years old. Her children were 6, 4, 3, and newborn. The newborn died the following spring. I don't know what became of the other 3. I think about them sometimes. I think about what she said to me in October of 1882. I cannot survive another delivery. She knew. She came to me because she knew, and she was asking the one person with the professional authority to help her. And I said nothing I could do. And she died, and the baby died, and 3 children grew up without a mother. And I wrote in my case notes, patient delivered successfully, and moved on to the next patient. There were colleagues of mine who did worse things than I did. I want to say that honestly, not to excuse myself, but because the history of medicine in this period is not the history of individual bad men. It is the history of a system, and the system produced a range of outcomes, and some of my colleagues sat at the worst end of that range in ways I did not. There was a physician in the next county who committed women to the asylum at the request of their husbands. Not women who were genuinely incapacitated. Women whose husbands found them inconvenient. Women who had expressed opinions their husbands disliked. Women who had refused what their husbands required of them. He signed the papers. He wrote the diagnoses. He had the authority, and he used it. He was considered a respectable man. He was invited to dinners. He published 2 papers in the Ohio Medical Journal. He died in 1891 with his reputation intact. I never committed a woman to an asylum at a husband's request. I never performed surgery on a woman without her consent. I never administered treatments by force. I want to be clear about that. I also want to be clear that the line between what I did and what my colleague in the next county did is a line of degree, not of kind. We were both operating within the same framework. We were both treating women's autonomy as a medical variable to be managed rather than a human fact to be respected. He managed it more aggressively than I did. The women in his care suffered more directly at his hands than the women in mine did. But the women in my care suffered. The difference was one of scale, not of principle. I am not comfortable with the comfort that distinction might offer. There was a woman named Mrs. Frances Whitmore who came to me in 1889. She was 38 years old, had been my patient for 11 years. She had 7 children living. She had suffered 3 miscarriages in that time, 1 at 4 months. She came to me in the spring of 1889, and she sat in my office and she didn't speak for a long time. I waited. I had learned to wait by then. She finally said, "My husband has asked when I will be well enough to try again." I had delivered her youngest 6 months prior. She had recovered slowly. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we both understood what was being discussed. I told her about the vinegar douche. I told her about the timing methods that women had been passing to each other in whispers for generations. I told her that none of these methods were reliable and that I could make no promises. I told her this quietly, as though someone might be listening, which was absurd in my own examination room with the door closed, but which reflected the way I still understood my own position, cautious, tentative, operating at the edge of what my professional standing allowed. She listened. She thanked me. She stood up and put on her coat and she said, "It's strange, isn't it, that I have to come to a doctor to be told something my grandmother probably knew?" She walked out. I sat with that for a while. She was right. The information she needed existed. It had been suppressed, denied, hidden by the same professional establishment that had a financial and ideological interest in women remaining in a condition of reproductive uncertainty. And I had given it to her quietly, as though it were something to be ashamed of. As though her right to some control over her own body were a favor I was extending, rather than something she should have had all along. I retired from practice in 1907. I was 64 years old. My wife had died in 1899 of a disease I had no treatment for, which is the particular cruelty medicine reserves for the physicians themselves. Competence that cannot reach the things that matter most to you. We had 2 children. Both grew to adulthood, which I do not take for granted given the era. I have 4 grandchildren. I am told the youngest looks like me, which is either a compliment or a curse depending on which version of me you are comparing to. I have had time to think, more time than I sometimes wanted in the years immediately after my wife died. Time to sit in my kitchen in the morning with my coffee and look back over 41 years of practice and ask the questions I couldn't ask while I was in the middle of it. Not the professional questions, not the diagnostic questions. The questions about what I was part of, what the institution I served was doing, and what I did within it, and what I could have done differently if I'd had the courage or the clarity earlier than I did. The young doctors coming up now are better than we were in some meaningful ways. There is more anesthesia. The germ theory has transformed surgery. Women die less often of childbed fever than they did in my early years, which is a genuine improvement that cost the men who established it their reputations and sometimes their careers. Ignaz Semmelweis died in an asylum, partly driven there by the professional establishment's refusal to accept that physicians were killing their patients by not washing their hands. They didn't want to hear it. It threatened too much. It threatened their certainty that what they were doing was helping, and certainty is the thing that physicians protect most ferociously. Because without certainty, you have to live with doubt, and doubt is where the difficult questions live. But there is something that has not changed, not in any fundamental way. Medicine was built by men, with men's bodies as the reference point, and everything that deviated from that reference point was treated as a variant, a lesser version, a problem to be managed. Women's pain was real, but it was ordinary pain, the pain of a system functioning as designed. Women's testimony about their own bodies was evidence, but evidence that needed to be filtered through the physician's superior understanding before it could be accepted. Women's choices about their own lives were choices, but choices that the physician, the husband, the law, and the church all retained the right to override for the woman's own benefit. That framework did not require malice. It required only certainty, only the unexamined conviction that the men in authority knew best. That conviction was the water we swam in. Some of us never noticed it was water. Some of us noticed too late. I want to speak about the women who never came to me, who couldn't come, who had no access to even the limited and flawed medicine I was practicing in rural Ohio. The women who delivered their children alone, or with only a neighbor for help, miles from any physician. The women who died of infections that I could have treated if I'd been called in time, which I wasn't, because calling the doctor cost money they didn't have. The women who managed their own health with the knowledge women had passed to each other across generations, knowledge that the medical profession had spent the last century trying to discredit and suppress because it was knowledge held by women and midwives rather than physicians, and the physician's professional status depended in part on maintaining the idea that medicine was something only physicians could provide. I had a complicated relationship with the midwives in my county. There were 3 when I arrived in Millfield. Women who had been attending births for decades, who knew more about the practical management of normal labor than I had learned in 6 years of medical school. I treated them with the condescension my training prepared me to express, tolerated them for uncomplicated cases, pushed them aside when things got difficult, occasionally criticized their methods in front of patients in ways that undermined their authority and transferred it to me. I was young and credentialed, and the credential gave me standing that their decades of experience did not, in the eyes of the families who had to choose. That system benefited me professionally. It did not benefit the patients. One of the midwives, a woman named Mrs. Ruth Dancy, who was then perhaps 60 years old, said to me in 1867, in the kitchen of the Elmore farmhouse after we had attended a complicated birth together, and both the mother and child had survived, "You know, doctor, I've been at this since before you were born, and the difference between a good outcome and a bad one is mostly patience and clean hands. You have clean hands. You're learning patience." She said it without malice, just as information, the way a more experienced colleague might speak to a younger one. I thanked her stiffly and went home and wrote in my notes that I had managed the Elmore delivery. That she had been present I did not mention. That her experience had been valuable. That her steadiness had helped the mother through the long middle hours while I was debating intervention I did not mention. She was a midwife. Her contribution was not the kind the medical record kept. She died in 1878. I attended her professionally in her last months. She had a cancer of the stomach, and there was nothing to be done except manage the pain, which I did as well as I could. She bore it with the same stillness she brought to everything. The last time I visited her, she was very weak, lying in her bed with the autumn light coming through the window, and she said, "I delivered 431 babies in this county, doctor. I counted them. I kept a book. Do you know how many of the mothers died? 11. 11 in 40 years. That was her accounting. I didn't ask what she wanted me to do with it. I think she just wanted to say it to someone, to have it acknowledged before she died. So I acknowledged it. I said, 'That is a remarkable record, Mrs. Dancy.'" She closed her eyes. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if anything I said to her in those last months was enough to account for the years of treating her as a lesser practitioner of a lesser art. I hope it was something. I suspect it wasn't. But there is something that has not changed, not in any fundamental way. Medicine was built by men, with men's bodies as the reference point, and everything that deviated from that reference point was treated as a variant, a lesser version, a problem to be managed. Women's pain was real, but it was ordinary pain, the pain of a system functioning as designed. Women's testimony about their own bodies was evidence, but evidence that needed to be filtered through the physician's superior understanding before it could be accepted. Women's choices about their own lives were choices, but choices that the physician, the husband, the law, and the church all retained the right to override for the woman's own benefit. That framework did not require malice. It required only certainty, only the unexamined conviction that the men in authority knew best. That conviction was the water we swam in. Some of us never noticed it was water. Some of us noticed too late.